welcome to the Uber Cordero show for this week. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. You can also follow us on Twitter at the Uber Cordero show and on Instagram as well as on Facebook. This week, we discuss a rather controversial issue that is often left unsaid in the discussion of African and African American affairs. I focus on transatlantic slave trade in Africa. I analyze the place of Africans in this slave trade. Did Africans sell their own brothers and sisters? Why did slavery happen? I do not expect this week to be a happy one. It will probably upset some people. Yet the point of this show is to educate the public, and a lot of information relating to the enslavement of African people exists. While this is a broad topic that cannot be exhausted in this video, I do hope that my presentation will generate curiosity for those who want to learn more. Black people make up 13% of the United States population, amounting to about 40 million people according to Pew Research. In 2016, the number of black immigrants stood at 4.2 million people, including African Americans, Caribbean immigrants, Latin American black people, and recent European black immigrants. If black people were a country, they will make the population of Uganda as of 2017. African Americans stand apart from other racial groups in the United States because of their involuntary immigration. History has indicated that the early Africans in the US, preceding the landing of the first Africans in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, were free people. After that, most black people were involuntary immigrants, quote-unquote enslaved people. African Americans were robbed of their human dignity and commodified into capital goods. The purpose was to promote development and economic growth of Europe and America. The nature of the enslavement and the subjugation by Europeans constituted a first time in the use of race as a determinant of slavery in human history. It is true that the tension arising from this episode has not been fully resolved, and today's Black Lives Matter movement is a descendant of the cumulative effect of these unresolved effects of a rather violent and impactful episode of human history. This week, I discussed the role of Africa and Africans in the eventual dislocation of its people. People have asked me, was indeed Africans who enslaved and sold their own? And I argue that the answer to that question is very complicated and nuanced. And while it is true that some Africans participated in slavery, the context in which they did participate is quite unique and different. So in this presentation, I make it clear that slavery did exist in Africa. I also document that some Africans participated in slavery in liaison with enslavers from Europe and Arabia. Yet the effect of slavery on Africans have been dire and has relegated the place of black people as less than human beings until 1960s, and still work has to be done in that regard. It has subjected the continent to an erasure of their contribution to humanity, to economic development, to human civilization as a whole. But slavery has also demonstrated the resilience of African people. It has led to creative innovations, talents, acts of courage, and the eventual surge of the United States as an unquestionable world power. African American culture is today a part and a constituent of American culture. And African American excellence is also part of American excellence. But just because people have made the best out of very horrible conditions does not excuse the horrible things that happen to their families, to these individuals who were captured. So one of the things that I want to do in this show is to highlight the differences between the context of African slavery and the context of American slavery. And so the fundamental nuances about African slavery, also called Old World slavery, and the new slavery in America called chattel slavery. It is important to make this distinction. Slavery has been part of human life for a long time, but there are different distinctions on each episode of human history about how slavery was carried out. For example, in African context, slavery was for a limited time. Slaves could be captured out of a war or because of a death or a criminal activity or a rebellion. There were social codes on how the enslaved will be treated. The slaves had rights and were not property. They could marry, they could own their own good or property or create wealth, and their children were not slaves. In some cases, slaves rose out of their conditions and established nations or empires. It has been rumored that Mansa Musa, perhaps the richest African who ever lived, came from a slave family. I do not have evidence for that. It's just something that I've read somewhere. In chattel slavery, which is in American slavery, slaves were property. People will be enslaved for life, and their descendants could be enslaved and were oftentimes as enslaved. Slaves had no right, and a U.S. court ruled that slaves were only 2/3 of a person. They could not testify in court. Their marriages were often invalidated or were at the prerogative of their enslaver. The more slaves you had in the United States, the better off you were. You were considered an outstanding member of the society. Slaves were bought for life, and often their children will be born into the household for life as well. Slaves had no rights and were treated as inhumanly and brutally, as in some cases, even killed without consequences. The second difference between African slavery and American slavery was that it was based on race. And individuals brought to America were often enslaved because of conflicts or deaths by people who looked like them or who spoke a language close to theirs. It was mostly often of ethnic differences or ethnic conflicts. In American, individuals were enslaved specifically because they were black, because of their race. It did not matter if they were Christians or Muslims. It just mattered that they were black. These individuals were also relegated from humanity. They were not to be considered fully human. And even though Africa had a long history of civilization and of close contact with Europe, and for a long time, European history did not racialize African people. By the 16th century and up to 17th century, at the outset of slavery, African humanity was reduced to justify enslaving them. Another distinction that I make was that African slavery was often in small scale and participated in subsistence farming or travel in caravans with different people. European slavery in America, on the other hand, was in millions of people. About 12 million African people were transferred from West Africa and other parts of the Atlantic Africa into the New World. So let us look into who were the enslavers in Africa, which families and empires participated, and just to get a little context of what that means. So we have tackled the key differences between chattel slavery and slavery in Africa. So right now we're going to look at who are the enslavers in Africa. And this might not come out clear, but the point here is intellectual honesty. We are trying to examine what happened and to offer an understanding to everyone who might be interested in this topic. So, like I said, slavery, as was in other parts of the world, was also a common practice in Africa. In the North African region, the Mamluk fighters, who are mostly Islamic, highly trained commandos, captured Berber slaves and were also involved in Barbary wars. And in many cases, this involved capturing slaves. And like I said before, this wasn't racialized. It was just you were caught in the mix and you were made to be a slave. In the Horn of Africa, the Christian Ethiopian kings captured slaves from the hinterland, mostly women, to Christianize them. So Ethiopia, Somalia region, a lot of slavery happened there. Yet for the transatlantic trade, the Congo Kingdom was the biggest source. By the second half of the 18th century, the Congo Kingdom had become the biggest source of slave caravans, both to the New World, also to East Africa and to Arabia. While the slave trade in the Congo stimulated economic growth and connected the Congo Kingdom both to Europe and also to Arabia, the profits of this trade went to only few dealers who became merchants and middlemen of European and Arabian traders. One example here is a Zanzibaris Arab called Tipu Tip. Tipu Tip will lead caravans of slave traders from coast of Mombasa and Dar es Salaam and walk them into the center of Central Africa, and he will capture slaves and kill elephants and take their tusks to the coast and export them to other parts of the world where they will be very visible. The Tipu family is still in Zanzibar and they are still as wealthy. You know, the proceeds mostly of what this slave trader Tipu did. Then when you go to West Africa, there is a concept called assimilative slavery arising from the transatlantic slave trade. So with the development of this trans-Saharan slave trade and economies of gold in Western Sahel region, that is present-day Western Africa, a number of the major empires that came around that region, including the Ghana Empire, not the Ghana country, but the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire, involved communities that profited from capturing people who had been war prisoners and selling them to the Arabs, and also gold. So this was, as gold resources started to shrink, they started enslaving prisoners of war arising from conflicts over resources like gold or agricultural land. However, most communities in West Africa resisted this type of trade, and it was restricted to people who had expertise in this trade and had connection with Arabs and Europeans. So the effect was that a lot of African people who had knowledge of slave trade and had connection with the Europeans started capturing people inland and bringing them to the coast. And as the transatlantic trade intensified, more and more people, they will go further inland to capture people. And the eventual result was dislocation of very many people. So yes, there are people who profited from slavery, but there are also people who had connection to European traders who had docked their ships at the coastal parts of Western Africa, mostly in Senegal and also in Benin. So that is slavery in West Africa. This slavery was called assimilative because of the adoptive way that it took, in that many of these people hadn't been slave traders, they were really gold traders, but as gold resources shrank, they changed their trade to slave trade, and were also aided by availability of guns, mostly sold by Danish settlers, Danish shipmen who had lived in West Africa for quite a long time, and the Portuguese. So as they got guns, it became easier to acquire slaves, and they went further inland. At some point, the European explorers had so much knowledge of the hinterland of West Africa, they didn't need the middlemen. So they just went and captured these slaves, and sometimes even captured those who were already trading slaves. So I'm not sorry for them, but that happened too. Those who had enslaving people also got caught up in the mix. In Southern Africa, there was a lot of indentured servants from India and from the Indian subcontinent, like also in the Caribbean. And because there were Dutch settlers in Southern Africa, Dutch colonies, especially Indonesia and other places like Malaysia, which was an English colony, had people who were forcefully immigrated to Southern Africa and then forced into slavery, especially in the Cape Colony. And as today, you find a big population, quite a substantial, I won't say big, people of Asian origin in South Africa arising from this enslaving of Asian people in Southern Africa. Then there was also the Zulu Wars, which triggered a movement of people from Southern Africa all the way to the north. So you, like right now, you find Ndebele people, practically Zulus, living in Zimbabwe, forced out of the encroachment of the Zulu Empire and capturing of people forcefully to work for them as either soldiers or farmers. So here I'm also describing internal dynamics of, influence of a certain nation, like the Zulu nation, being more powerful and being able to capture other people either forcefully or voluntarily joining them, while also practicing things that had elements of slavery. So we have here multiple layers. There's Arab slavery, there is transatlantic slavery, and there is also slavery within Africans themselves. The main point here that all these forms of slavery affected people's lives and hurt many people, and they were wrong from the start and they were wrong in the end. But it's important for us to understand that it is not an easy topic to talk about, and it is one that's often not said. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, but the truth is slavery did exist in Africa, and slavery also existed within Africans treating themselves. But the transfer of people from the African continent to colonial America and other parts of the New World was so unique that it distorted and disrupted all the forms of slavery that had existed. And the consequences of that transferring of massive people has been, for the most part, very positive, very negative in the way that it has unresolved differences that we are still grappling with today, as evidenced by Black Lives Matter, the quest for an wholesome embrace of humanity of people of darker skin. If you like what we're presenting, be sure to subscribe and join us next week for more episodes. I will be talking about what people recommend. So if you want me to discuss a specific topic, mention it on the comments or email me or find a way to reach me, and I'll be able to tackle it. Thank you so much, and see you next week.